We all know the stories of Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp, but what about the black lawman who caught over 3,000 criminals? Or the 5-foot-tall nun who made Billy the Kid back down? Today, we're uncovering the most incredible Wild West heroes your history teacher never told you about. These aren't tall tales or frontier myths. These are true stories that will change everything you thought you knew about the American frontier. Get ready for the untold stories of the real heroes who shaped the West. And wait until you hear about the female doctor who performed surgery by candlelight during a blizzard. The tale of Dr. Susan Anderson, the Angel of the Rockies. In the winter of 1876, as most people fled the harsh Colorado mountains, one woman made them her home. Dr. Susan Anderson, Doc Susie, to those who knew her, wasn't your typical frontier doctor. Suffering from tuberculosis herself, she had come west seeking cure in the mountain air. Instead, she found her life's calling. Picture a woman, barely 5 feet tall, trudging through mountain passes in the dead of night. Her medical bag, heavy with supplies, swinging by her side. While others sought gold in these mountains, Doc Susie mined something far more precious, the trust and gratitude of an entire community. They said it was no place for a woman doctor. The mining camps of Colorado were rough, dangerous places where life hung by a thread. But Doc Susie proved them wrong. When a diphtheria epidemic struck Fraser Valley in 1895, she worked 48 hours straight, moving from cabin to cabin as death stalked the community. When other doctors refused to treat the poorest miners, she was there, often accepting payment in firewood or vegetables. The stories of her dedication became legend. There was the time she performed an emergency appendectomy on a kitchen table during a blizzard, using only kerosene lamps for light, or the night she amputated a miner's frozen legs with nothing but whiskey for anesthetic. But perhaps most remarkable was her daily routine, treating everything from gunshot wounds to childbirth complications, often traveling miles through treacherous terrain to reach her patients. For 47 years, she served the mining communities of Colorado. Through boom and bust, through blistering summers and brutal winters, Doc Susie remained. She wasn't just treating illnesses, she was building trust, creating community, and proving that true grit isn't measured by the size of your gun, but by the size of your heart. When the railroad came through Fraser Valley, she became its surgeon, treating injured workers and maintaining the health of hundreds of men who carved the tracks through the mountains. The same men who had once doubted a woman doctor now refused to be treated by anyone else. By the time she died in 1960, Doc Susie had delivered over 1,000 babies, performed countless surgeries, and saved more lives than anyone could count. She never became rich, often treating patients for free when they couldn't pay. But she left behind a legacy far more valuable than gold, the proof that one person's dedication can change an entire community. The mountains where Doc Susie once rode still stand, silent witnesses to her courage. Her story reminds us that the true heroes of the West weren't always the ones with the fastest draw or the most notorious reputation. Sometimes they were quiet warriors like Doc Susie, who fought their battles not with bullets, but with dedication, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to those in need. Stagecoach Mary. The mail must go through. Long before the first light of dawn, a formidable figure emerged from her cabin. Standing 6 feet tall, wearing a man's hat and carrying 2 guns, Mary Fields cut an imposing figure against the Montana sky. But it wasn't her appearance that made her legendary. It was her iron will and unshakable determination to deliver the mail, no matter what obstacles nature or man put in her way. Born into slavery in Tennessee around 1832, Mary Fields found freedom after the Civil War and made her way west, carrying with her nothing but raw courage and a fierce independence. In 1895, at the age of 63, when most people were settling into retirement, Mary took on one of the most dangerous jobs in the West, delivering mail through the untamed wilderness of Montana Territory. The route she chose was considered too dangerous for most men. 200 miles of treacherous mountain paths, crossing territories frequented by wolves, bears, and bandits. But Mary Fields wasn't most people. When her wagon broke down, she walked. When blizzards blocked the paths, She strapped the mail to her back and snowshoed through. When wolves circled her camp at night, she kept them at bay with her trusty rifle. They called her Stagecoach Mary, but that name barely captured her essence. To the nuns at St. Peter's Mission, where she worked before becoming a mail carrier, she was their fearless protector. To the children along her route, she was the kind lady who always carried candy in her pockets. To bandits who learned the hard way, she was someone to avoid at all costs. There's the story of the time her horses were spooked by a pack of wolves. As the wagon overturned in the snow, Mary stood her ground, defending the mail with her rifle until dawn. Or the time she fought off a band of thieves who thought an aging black woman would be an easy target. They learned otherwise when Mary's accurate shooting sent them fleeing into the night. For 8 years, she never missed a day of delivery, not when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero, not when spring floods washed out the roads, not when outlaws patrolled the territory. The mail had to go through, and Mary Fields made sure it did. But Mary was more than just tough, she was a pillar of her community. In Cascade, Montana, schools closed on her birthday. She was the only woman allowed to drink in the local saloons, where her bar fights were as legendary as her kindness to children. When she wasn't delivering mail, she babysat for local families and grew the most beautiful flowers in town, giving them away to anyone who asked. In an era when both her race and her gender should have limited her options, Mary Fields carved out her own path, quite literally, through the American West. She proved that courage knows no color, strength knows no gender, and determination knows no age. When she died in 1914, the whole town of Cascade mourned. They remembered not just the fearless mail carrier, but the woman who had shown them that true character isn't measured by where you come from, but by what you're willing to do to fulfill your duties. Today, the trails Mary once rode have become highways, but her spirit of determination lives on. In a West full of legendary figures, Stagecoach Mary stands apart, not just as the first African-American woman mail carrier, but as a symbol of what one person can achieve through sheer force of will. Policarpio Rodriguez, The Peacemaker's Path. In the blood-soaked landscape of Texas during the 1850s, where conflicts between settlers and Native Americans often ended in tragedy, one man chose a different path. Policarpio Rodriguez, known to many as Polly, became a legend not for the lives he took, but for the lives he saved through the power of diplomacy and understanding. Born in San Antonio in 1829 to Mexican parents, Rodriguez grew up straddling multiple worlds. He spoke Spanish, English, and several Native American languages fluently. But his greatest gift wasn't just his ability to translate words. It was his talent for translating hearts, for helping bitter enemies see each other's humanity. Consider the summer of 1855. Comanche raiders had been striking settlements across Texas, and revenge-minded settlers were preparing for bloody retaliation. Into this powder keg stepped Rodriguez, armed with nothing but his reputation for fairness and his deep understanding of both cultures. Over 3 days of tense negotiations, he helped both sides see beyond their immediate anger to forge a peace agreement that would last for years. But perhaps his most remarkable achievement came during the winter campaign of 1857, when a group of Texas Rangers discovered a large Comanche camp near the Nueces River. They prepared for a surprise attack. Rodriguez, knowing such an attack would trigger years of bloodshed, rode through a blizzard to reach the Rangers' camp. There, he convinced them to let him attempt negotiations first. Walking unarmed into the Comanche camp, Rodriguez spent hours in discussion with the tribal leaders. By dawn, he had not only prevented a battle, but had established a framework for peaceful coexistence that would help protect both settlers and Native Americans in the region. His methods were revolutionary for their time. While others saw only savages or invaders, Rodriguez saw human beings with legitimate grievances and hopes. He understood that lasting peace couldn't be built on force alone. It required understanding, respect, and fair dealing on both sides. Rodriguez's work wasn't limited to preventing conflicts. He became known as a skilled finder of lost children, using his tracking abilities and diplomatic connections to locate youngsters who had strayed into Native American territory. Time and again, he brought them home safely, often discovering they had been well treated by the very people the settlers feared most. His reputation grew to near mythical proportions. Both settlers and Native Americans spoke of him as a man whose word was his bond, whose integrity was beyond question. In an era when trust was as rare as water in the desert, Rodriguez became a well that never ran dry. Yet, for all his achievements, Rodriguez remained humble. He lived simply, supporting himself as a farmer and scout while continuing his piecework without payment. When asked why he risked his life to prevent conflicts between others, he would simply say, "The land has room enough for all, if we but have room enough in our hearts." By the time of his death in 1914, Policarpio Rodriguez had prevented more bloodshed through words than most warriors had caused with weapons. His legacy lives on, not in notches on a gun or scalps on a belt, but in the countless descendants of those whose lives he saved, both settler and Native American alike. In a frontier era that celebrated violence and glorified revenge, Rodriguez showed there was another way. He proved that true courage sometimes means standing between two angry forces with nothing but wisdom and words as your weapons. Bass Reeves, the real legend behind the badge. When people think of legendary lawmen of the Old West, they picture white cowboys with silver stars pinned to their chests. But the most extraordinary marshal of the frontier wore a very different face. Bass Reeves, born into slavery in 1838, would become the most successful deputy U.S. Marshal in American history, a man whose real-life exploits would put Hollywood's fictional heroes to shame. Imagine Arkansas Territory, 1875. A killer has been terrorizing settlers, hiding in what lawmen called the deadliest strip of land in America. Other marshals refused to pursue him, but Bass Reeves saddled up, rode out alone, and returned 2 weeks later with his man, alive, tied to his horse. It was just another day's work for the man they called the Invincible Marshal. Born into slavery in Crawford County, Arkansas, Bass Reeves got his first taste of freedom during the Civil War when his master took him into Indian Territory. Seizing his chance, Reeves escaped into the night. He lived among Native American tribes, learning their languages and mastering the territory's hidden trails, knowledge that would later make him an unparalleled lawman. After emancipation, Reeves built a life as a successful farmer and family man. But in 1875, Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge, chose him as one of the first black deputy U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi. At the time, Indian Territory was considered the most dangerous judicial district in the nation. It was here that Bass Reeves would write his legend. What made Reeves extraordinary wasn't just his stunning record, over 3,000 arrests and only 14 deaths in the line of duty. It was how he made those arrests. Reeves was a master of disguise and deception. He would enter dangerous territories dressed as a farmer, a cowboy, or even an outlaw. His ability to change his voice and manner was so complete that criminals never recognized the legendary lawman until the handcuffs were already on their wrists. Consider the time he tracked the notorious Miller brothers. For days, he followed their trail dressed as a trail cook. When he finally found their camp, he convinced them to hire him. That night, as they slept, Bass arrested all 6 members of the gang without firing a shot. Or the time he spent 3 weeks posing as an itinerant preacher to capture a murderer who had eluded justice for years. Unlike many lawmen of his era, Reeves preferred to take his prisoners alive. He was known for his extraordinary marksmanship, but even more for his cunning and patience. He could outwait, outthink, and outmaneuver the craftiest criminals. His dedication to justice was so complete that when his own son was charged with murder, Bass insisted on bringing him in himself. What's most remarkable about Reeves was his unwavering integrity in an era of widespread corruption. He couldn't read or write, yet he never once served a warrant to the wrong person. He was known to ride hundreds of miles to serve a single warrant, often bringing back multiple outlaws. In his 32-year career as a lawman, he never took a bribe and never failed to complete a mission. The statistics of his career are staggering. Over 3,000 felony arrests, including some of the most dangerous criminals of the era. He brought in murderers, horse thieves, bootleggers, and corrupt government officials. He survived countless ambushes and attempts on his life, earning a reputation for being impossible to kill. When Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907, Bass Reeves was forced to give up his badge due to laws preventing black men from serving as lawmen. But even then, at nearly 70 years old, he didn't retire. He became a police officer in Muskogee, where it was said that crime dropped significantly just because he walked the streets. The forgotten Native American Scouts, warriors between two worlds. In the shadows of the American frontier's most pivotal moments, a group of extraordinary individuals walked a dangerous line between two worlds. The Native American Scouts, men like Curly, White Swan, Goes Ahead, and dozens of others whose names have been lost to time, played a crucial role that history has largely forgotten. These weren't simply trackers hired to guide Army patrols. They were diplomats, strategists, and peacekeepers who often prevented more bloodshed than they enabled. Their story isn't just about tracking skills or military service. It's about individuals who made heart-wrenching choices in impossible situations, hoping to secure a future for their people. Take the story of Curly, a Crow Scout who could read the landscape like others read books. In 1876, he was serving with General Custer's 7th Cavalry. But unlike the popular tales of the Battle of Little Bighorn, Curly's real contribution came weeks before the famous battle. He repeatedly warned Custer about the massive size of the Native American coalition gathering in the valley. His warnings, tragically ignored, could have saved hundreds of lives on both sides. Or consider Black Beaver, a Delaware scout who sacrificed everything he owned to save hundreds of Union soldiers during the Civil War. When Confederate forces threatened to capture Fort Arbuckle, Black Beaver led the entire garrison through unmapped territory to safety. He lost his ranch, his livestock, and all his possessions to Confederate raiders in retaliation, yet he continued serving as a scout and interpreter for years afterward. These scouts walked in two worlds, carrying the weight of impossible choices. They knew that helping the Army might mean bringing harm to other Native Americans, possibly even their own distant relatives. Yet many believed that by serving as scouts they could minimize bloodshed and protect their own tribes from the worst of the Army's campaigns. Medicine Crow, a Crow Scout famous for his ability to locate water in the driest territories, once prevented a massacre by convincing an Army commander that a suspected hostile camp was actually a peaceful hunting party. His knowledge of tribal customs and behavior saved dozens of innocent lives that day. Yet, for his service, he was often branded a traitor by other Native Americans. The Scouts' expertise went far beyond tracking. They were cultural interpreters who understood the nuances of tribal diplomacy. They could read smoke signals, interpret trail signs, and recognize the significance of seemingly innocent camp movements. This knowledge often proved more valuable than any military intelligence. Many paid a terrible price for their service. When they returned to their tribes, they were sometimes treated as outcasts. When they dealt with white society, they faced discrimination despite their vital service. They lived in a gray zone between cultures, trusted fully by neither side. Yet their impact on the American West was profound. Through their efforts, countless lives were saved on both sides. They helped negotiate peaceful surrenders, prevented ambushes, located lost children, and guided hunting parties to game during harsh winters. Their legacy lives on in the very peace they helped forge, even if their names have been forgotten. Perhaps most importantly, these scouts demonstrated that loyalty and courage aren't bound by race or culture. In an era of stark divisions, they proved that understanding and cooperation were possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. Today, the trails they once rode have vanished, and the landscapes they knew so intimately have changed beyond recognition. But their legacy of courage, sacrifice, and wisdom remains, a testament to those who dared to bridge the divide between worlds. Sister Blandina Segal, the nun who tamed the West. In the rough and tumble world of New Mexico territory where outlaws ruled and violence was common as dust, an unlikely hero emerged wearing not a sheriff's badge but a nun's habit. Sister Blandina Segal, known to many as the fastest nun in the West, proved that sometimes the strongest force in the frontier wasn't the gun, it was unwavering compassion. Born in Italy and arriving in Trinidad, Colorado, in 1877, Sister Blandina stepped into a world that seemed to have forgotten mercy. Her first test came when she heard that a gang of outlaws was planning to scalp 4 doctors in revenge for one of their members dying during surgery. Without hesitation, she confronted the gang. Standing barely 5 feet tall, she faced down hardened killers and convinced them to abandon their vendetta. But it was her encounter with Billy the Kid that became legendary. Word reached her that the notorious outlaw was planning to kill a man who had wounded one of his companions. Sister Blandina visited the wounded man, nursing him back to health. Then she confronted Billy himself, demanding he abandon his plans for revenge. To everyone's amazement, the kid agreed. From that day forward, Billy the Kid never allowed his gang to rob from any wagon train carrying a nun, yet these dramatic confrontations weren't what made Sister Blandina extraordinary. It was her daily work that truly transformed the frontier. She built schools in communities where children had never seen a book. She established hospitals where before the sick and injured had nowhere to turn. In Santa Fe, she created the first public school system and opened St. Vincent Hospital, which still serves the community today. Her methods were as practical as they were compassionate. When she discovered that local railway workers were being charged excessive rates for medical care, she negotiated with the railway company to establish fair prices. When she found children going hungry, she organized community food drives. When she saw injustice, she confronted it, whether it came from outlaws or corrupt officials. Consider the time she discovered a man who had been shot and left for dead outside of town. Other settlers were afraid to help, fearing the shooter's return. Sister Blandina not only tended to the man's wounds but also tracked down his would-be killer. Through patience and persistence, she convinced the shooter to repent and eventually brought about reconciliation between the two men. Her influence extended beyond individual acts of mercy. She became known as a fearless advocate for the rights of Native Americans and Mexican Americans in the territory. When others saw only savages or foreigners, she saw human beings deserving of dignity and justice. She fought against land grabs that threatened indigenous communities and spoke out against racial discrimination in all its forms. In an era when women were expected to be silent and submissive, Sister Blandina's voice rang out clear and strong. She challenged corrupt officials, confronted violent gangs, and stood up to powerful business interests. Her weapon wasn't a six-shooter. It was her unshakable belief in the power of compassion to transform even the hardest hearts. By the time she left New Mexico in 1897, Sister Blandina had created a network of schools, hospitals, and orphanages that served all people regardless of race, religion, or social status. Her legacy wasn't just in the buildings she raised, but in the lives she transformed and the example she set. If you found these incredible stories as fascinating as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on our journey through the hidden history of the American West.